All right. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to start off by thanking my younger cousin, Michael, for the warm welcome, the song, and the prayer. Absolutely imperative that we start off in a good way, and he definitely sets the tone for all of us today. And of course, the Salmon Foundation and the Rivershed Society for allowing the Lower Fraser to provide some insight to the nations. And I'm going to launch right in. We got a short time here, and I want to make sure my co-presenter Ian has lots of time to share as well. Uh, so, Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance was asked to share some perspectives, importance, and priorities. But really, I'm going to focus mostly on perspectives, high-level perspectives and priorities. I'm going to leave the importance to the First Nations because that's where the shared information should come from. So hopefully those that are leaders from the nations in Lower Fraser are here today can share as we go through. And just a quick presentation overview. I want to provide some Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance background. Again, some perspectives on governance and maybe some priorities moving forward. And so this is just an org chart. I won't get into any in-depth conversation at this time, but what I wanted to share mostly is that we serve the First Nations of the Lower Fraser, and really that's our focus as far as our group, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. We're very much an advocacy, coordination, communication, and a tech support group. We're not rights-based holders, and so we leave that all for the nations to take care of. But we do serve 30 First Nations in the Lower Fraser. Formally, 23 are affiliated with our governance protocol. And of course, we've got an executive committee that provides oversight to our operations. And you'll see a whole host of acronyms in here that I won't get into. There's lots of lines of business that we're involved with. But if there's interest, I'd be happy to follow up with others at a later date. And this is just our operations in terms of, as I mentioned, executive committee members. There's 9 that serve 4 regions in the Lower Fraser, which I'll share later. And myself as the executive director. You know what? I failed to introduce myself. So Murray Ned, Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance Executive Director. Sorry about that. My home village is Sumas First Nation out in the Fraser Valley. We're one of the Stalo First Nation communities. There's approximately 24 First Nations. And my ancestral name is Colossenton. So sorry about that. I just jumped right into the presentation. And we have a small finance and admin regime. We have a biologist team we call the Biosphere that is growing ever so much lately, and it's probably reflective of where we're going with science and the need for resource management and habitat restoration. And we also have a number of contract services we enter into as well. So that's just a quick showing of the complexities that have grown since 2010 when the organization was formed. So this is 12 years later. This reflects the 30 First Nations that I have mentioned, and not everybody participates at the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance. As I mentioned, we have 23 formally, and there's a few that still that aren't affiliated, still engaged with the Lower Fraser. And this is a map. It's not the best of maps with all the funky polygons that are there, but we have formed within our governance protocol into 4 regions. And so we've got the mouth of the Fraser to the Port Mann to Mission Bridge to Hope, and Hope to Sawmill Creek, which is Yale. And really, these are regions that the department over a period of time, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have devised to help manage fisheries. And at the time of the inception of the organization, we felt this was the easiest way to proceed, and maybe moving forward, watershed approaches might be a better approach, and that is something Ian Hamilton will talk about. And this is the Mission to Hope region. There's 19 First Nations encompassed within that territory, and also the area that the Heart of the Fraser wants to focus on. So if you wanted to challenge yourselves with those 4 regions that we're talking about, the 19 nations is a good one to start with. So I'm sure there's a strong interest in figuring out how to collaborate moving forward. I wanted to speak a little bit to governance, First Nations governance and government themselves, whether it's DFO or other ministries, and the decision-making and authority that's involved with it. And I call this the inverted triangle. And if I start with the First Nations leadership to begin with at the bottom of the blue triangle, that's really where the rights-based interests reside and where the mandate and decision-making authority comes. And if I just work myself up that triangle a little bit more to the regional body, such as an organization like the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, we have limited mandate. We get our mandate through the 23 First Nations, and we just respect what the nations do within their territories and provide services. And as you make your way further up that triangle, you got the First Nations Fisheries Council at the provincial level, and the various leadership council entities, BC Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the AFN group, and the First Nations Summit. And they have limited mandate as well. Like I mentioned, most of the mandate and decision-making authority lies within the nations. And if I transition over to the green government triangle and decision-making authority, most of it resides within the ministerial area with Ministry of Fisheries, locally with the RDG. And when I go further down, we got the Fraser River region area, which is most of the Fraser watershed, and of course, resource management in the Lower Fraser. And what we see today is much of the engagement happens between First Nations and the Lower Fraser resource management area. And so that is delegated authority to resource management people that deal with 25 First Nations, or 30 First Nations in Lower Fraser. And so we've got this disparity of authority that occurs, and there's much need for looking for reform on that moving forward. I apologize, my cell phone blinked out briefly. Here I go with technology. And so very often First Nations leaders find themselves living in two worlds. And when I do a little bit of the comparative on the Indigenous side, very much a communal, family-based governance type of arrangement that's been inherent in our communities for many years, many centuries. Of course, Indigenous knowledge is used. Decisions are based on worldview. Everything is connected, as my younger cousin, I want to call him Kevin, but his name is Michael, shared earlier. His dad is Kevin. And we think 7 generations forward and 7 generations back whenever we're trying to think about resource management and other things related to the resources. When we look at government, it's more of the top-down typical governance model that you see. Western science is a key importance to them with their decision making, as is socioeconomics and, of course, politically driven decision making. And of course, these are terms of 4 years, and you see how much you can get done in that 4 years, and you pretty much hope for the best. So that's no disrespect to government bodies or agencies, but that's a reality that we live in. So the question is, how do we harmonize? How do we get these two governments between Indigenous and the Government of Canada or BC to harmonize? And maybe UNDRIP, maybe DRIPA, maybe reconciliation is the way to go. And that might be inclusive of devolution. So just thinking about salmon and the crisis that we have on our hands, and sometimes people, maybe even government, are oblivious to exactly what is happening with the fish, and it comes in trends and waves at times. And in 2009, just to use sockeye as an example, we had 1.2 million escapement, and we thought that was a major disaster, and it really was. It's probably the least amount of escapement you can have for the amount of sockeye that we have in the territories in the Fraser watershed. But it broke a record from the 1800s, and then it triggered the Cohen inquiry. And so if we fast forward to and that was a $30 million investment by government. So if we fast forward, just one decade forward, there was an escapement of about 470,000 fish. And that didn't trigger any inquiry. And one of the things we did recognize too, that there's environmental Environmental impacts such as the big bar that had major impacts for the ability for those fish that were able to get by to escape through the big bar. And in 2020, 360 escapement for sockeye, a major disaster, major impact on First Nations' ability to access fish, but more importantly, to conserve and preserve what was available to make it to the spawning grounds. So what does this hold for the future of fish and fisheries? It's a good question. And essentially, we're managing what's left in the territories up and down the Fraser watershed and even on the coast. And, these fishery reductions have major impacts to the nations. There's food security concerns. We're not meeting our FSC annually for any of the species. We're losing our cultural identity by not being able to practice the fishery. And so, when we translate that in the ability to practice the fishery and share the knowledge, in the early 1990s, we could fish 3 days a week all year, no questions asked. And it was rather nice because you could leisurely go out and time your fisheries. It wasn't a frenzy to get out on the water. And you'll see the time frames I'm sharing there. I think it's, I can't see all that good on my screen, but it's about 3,700 hours. And if we fast forward to fisheries that occurred in 2021, we had 15 days of fishery. So we're measuring our fishery in days now rather than weeks or years, and about 360 hours annually. So that's stark comparison. It's about 10% of what we had if you look at 3 decades of time frame. So a little bit about government and resourcing, and I don't mean to pick on government, but this is something we've recognized in the short period that the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance has been established. And we look at all of the investments, the Ocean Protection Plan, $1.5 billion, the fee programs introduced in 2018 with Coastal Restoration Fund, Canadian Nature Fund, and the BC SRIF. Great funding initiatives. Don't get me wrong, I think it's awesome that government is investing. That's about $450 million there. Salmon Treaty was negotiated in 2018. There's $15 million, $150 million over 10 years. And most recently, the PSSI, the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, another injection of $647 million. The challenge we have here is really the top-down investments and approach from government, and often it's a mandate from the minister or the ministries, and Pacific region is tasked with implementation. Often it's siloed, often it's unilateral implementation, and by that I mean First Nations aren't involved with the development of the programs. Many of you that are in the call today are not involved. So we need to find a different way of doing business moving forward. And so I shared this with a few people and established this diagram a while back. And that kind of, I guess, management and coordination feels like this. It doesn't feel like it's coordinated. It doesn't feel harmonized. And everybody's wanting to do the right things for the fish in the water. But there's a lot of redundancy and a lot of overlap. And so if we, had a simplistic way of showing how we might move into the future from a First Nation perspective, we feel that there's a real need for a G3 government to government relationship. We can never discount the importance of stakeholders, local jurisdictions, and international regimes like the Pacific Salmon Treaty, academia, the importance of bringing everybody into one venue to have these discussions to deal with salmon crisis. So I blasted through this pretty quickly, and I just thinking of a few priorities moving forward. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of interest in UNDRIP, DRIPA, and the reconciliation considerations, but there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know exactly what that means from a First Nation perspective, and I think government's still trying to work their way to figure out a way forward with it as well. So from a First Nation perspective, as I mentioned, there's really a strong indication that a G3 is imperative moving forward. That would include a devolution of authority and resources, and we know how challenging that might be for government, but I think that's a reality, and that really would put First Nations in a place prior to contact that would enable them to resume managing resources in partnership with government. And there's a strong interest in establishing a lower center of excellence or expertise. And I know the PSSI has mentioned that, and that could mean a lot of different things, but we'd love to set something up in the Lower Fraser like that. And First Nations, oh man, governance for First Nations, we have been taught to be independent and removed from our tribal entities and former governance regimes. And now we're having to collect ourselves. And so we too, at the international, provincial, regional, and nation level, have a lot of work to do. But the time has never been right. And with crisis on the loom, I think it brings everybody together. And I just mentioned the salmon crisis, obviously strengthening working relationships with stakeholders, NGOs, and industry is really important. And the final thing is moving from what we see as governance structures to more of a tribal formation of management. And Ian Hamilton, my co-presenter, is going to speak to some of the work we're doing at a watershed scale and introducing that to the nations. So I thank you for the time to share a little bit of a snapshot of the Lower Fraser and the kind of work we're trying to introduce with the nations at the forefront, and look forward to the rest of the session today. Thank you. Aichkasiam.